Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gamespace. Thank you for braving the incredibly cold weather, the blizzards, the wolves to make it here to the Swiss Game Hub. So it's going to be a little bit fiddly because my computer's not working quite right, but I'm sure we'll manage. Okay, so this is Gamespace. The main thing today is that I'm going to give a brief talk about processing user feedback. But before that, we're just going to look at upcoming events and also at game-related news. Upcoming event is pretty straightforward. We are going to have a pub quiz about games next Thursday. We're going to have our traditional testing night the Wednesday after that, where you can bring your own games and you can try them out with other people. And then the next Gamespace is going to be on September 11th. Gamespace is always on the second Thursday of the month. The pub quiz is on the third Thursday, and the testing night is on the last Wednesday of the month. The next Gamespace is going to be about accessibility. So how to make it that people can play your game even if they have any kind of accessibility requirement, from being colorblind to currently holding a cat or a baby in one arm, or any number of other things. But yeah, so that's what's going on in the future, and these will repeat forever. Absolutely forever. Okay, and then game news. I have some good news and some bad news. Good news is we have two new Swiss games that have been released. The Wandering Village has released its 1.0 version, so it's come out of early access into the proper full version. You can see the Onbu back here watching over you from its location on top of the fridge. Also, Playables has released Time Flies, which is another very adorable kind of animation style game. I'm just going to try and... No, I'm not going to try and show you the trailers, sorry. And in bad news, so you know how we had all of these news in recent game spaces about like mass layoffs, like big game studios, like last time it was like Microsoft laid off like 9,000 people in gaming, and it's always like big company lays off several thousand people and so on. This time it's more individualized because this month, three kind of indie studios led by fairly well-known people have closed to one degree or another. So Romero Games, which was one of the games studios that belonged to Microsoft, was originally just looking like it was going to be severely downsized, but now actually has just closed entirely. So no more Romero Games. Maschinenmensch, which is the studio that made Curious Expedition 1 and 2, who most recently made Mother Machine, and who co-founded Saftladen, which is a co-working space for game developers. That was a big inspiration for the Swiss Game Hub. They have officially put their studio in hibernation. The reason being that they couldn't secure any funding for future projects. So it's like no one wants to give them any money to make games, and so they basically had to downsize their company to the two founders and had to let everyone else go. And basically same thing with Bithell Games, so that's Mike Bithell of Thomas Was Alone and Tron something fame, and exactly same story there. Again, they released a game, or they're actually about to release their latest game, but again, haven't been able to find any funding for future projects, and so again, essentially the studio is closed or in hibernation, has essentially been reduced to the founder because there's no more money. So that's great. I was going to do a talk about publishers, or I was going to make someone do a talk about publishers at Gamespace at some point. But right now I feel like there's not much point because the talk would just be screaming for several hours. So we'll put that off for a while. Anyway, Swiss games are doing perfectly well. Just everyone else is imploding. Okay, great. So that was that. We now move on to the main course, which is the talk. So yeah, if you haven't guessed yet, my computer refuses to mirror the displays. So yeah. Okay, so this is a actually really old talk. I did go back over it. I gave this talk about 6 years ago for the first time at DevCon. It's originally based on my experiences making Airships Conquer the Skies, which is like a complicated real-time strategy game, and also my experiences in early game projects, and having very difficult experiences with user feedback, with people reporting bugs and so on. And I kind of developed this framework in the end. I thought about it a lot, why it was hard to understand what people actually were reporting, or why were people giving me these rude and incomprehensible bits of feedback. And so I developed this process. And the process is basically there to allow you to think through this step by step and take some of the emotion out of it, and actually get some useful results. So it's a 6-stage model for helping you cope. Okay, so yeah, as I said, negative feedback is very frustrating, especially if you're like the lead developer or whatever. This is your baby. People are saying mean things about your baby. It's extremely hard to cope with. And I mean, obviously there's negative feedback that's just plain rude. There's a negative feedback where you have no idea what the person is saying, and you're like, these words should not go in that order. That's not a sentence, sir. And the ones where people just state things which you factually know are not true. Like they complain about the AI cheating in some way, and you know that the AI doesn't cheat because you programmed it. And this can get frustrating because you're like, yeah, well, what? A, it's emotionally hard, and B, it's not actionable. You want user feedback, you need user feedback, because as a developer, you don't have a complete perspective on your own game. You do need external people to tell you what's good, what's bad, whatever. But if you just stick to the bits of feedback that you already kind of agree with and understand, you're probably missing some stuff. So how do you deal with that? So yeah, the point is, it does all come from a real pain point. So that's the first thing I really want to that's the first important thing here, is that excepting for some weird trolls, people don't go to the effort of writing you feedback for funsies. They do it because they had a bad experience with the game, or an experience with the game, and they want you to know about it. So even if it makes no sense, even if it seems completely wrong-headed or whatever, this person was sufficiently moved or annoyed that they wrote you something. And so somewhere hidden in those words is an actual pain point you have to dig out if you can. Which brings us to this model, which is basically a pipeline going from the actual underlying bug to what arrives in your ears or eyes at the other end. And I'm going to go through each of these. And the point is that the actual root cause, the underlying bug, gets filtered through each of these stages, and it gets translated and distorted potentially by each of these stages, which is why at the end what arrives with you seems to make no sense. And the aim is that if you know about each of these stages, you can work backwards through them and at least try to figure out where these distortions have come from, and figure out what the underlying problem is, or figure out what kind of questions to ask to arrive at the underlying problem. So we're going to go through those. So the root cause is, the thing that's actually wrong. Let's just stick to there's something actually wrong with your game and someone has written to you about it. And it's a bug, like genuinely just a bug, or you did do a bad balancing thing, Or the game is fine, but it doesn't communicate things properly. It just didn't explain something, it didn't show something, or whatever. So one example, which is very much from personal experience, you make a tutorial, and it's like some kind of fighting game where you shoot at each other. It turns out that, you can just actually fail the tutorial. You can just do all the things the tutorial tells you to do. And if you roll really badly, you just lose. And this is obviously kind of bad, because then people are like, what did I do wrong? Is there something I don't understand? No, you just made a bad tutorial and you didn't realize it. So, okay, that's what you actually want to arrive at. You actually want to know, it turns out that if you roll, the worst possible roll on all of your attack rolls, then you lose. But that's not what the player tells you. Of course not. They don't know your game like you do. So we get to the player experience. Now, this is different because we're not talking about the bug. We are talking to the experience of one specific player. And each of these experiences is different. As you well know, players sometimes have really weird setups. They're playing using some weird hardware and software setup. They're running some weird overlay that does something horrifying to their graphics drivers. They somehow find a very special version of Windows that should never have been released into the wild, or they just play the game in a weird way and experience like an edge case, like, they rolled really badly in the tutorial. And so let's say this player tries the tutorial twice and gets super unlucky twice and just loses both times despite doing all the right things. This will happen, right? If there's a 3% chance, there's a 3% chance of a 3% chance. So if your game is popular enough, even really weird edge cases will happen to players. So concrete example, I really have a concrete example there, was I made this like space exploration role-playing game. At some point, it's like Star Trek, and you could like send an away team down to the planet, and they would like stumble around in some ruins, and there was an event that could happen where one of your characters could get injured, and then they were basically dead, but you could bring them back to life if you have a doctor. Now, one player had this event twice to send an away team down twice with the doctor, and each time it was the doctor who died. So they were back saying, like, it's really unfair that you've programmed it that it kills the doctor every time. And I was like, I did not program this. It's just you send 5 people down in the away team, you do it twice. Well, there's a 1 in 25 chance that the doctor dies twice. And hey, it happened twice, it must happen every time. This is a reasonable, so now we're at the perception bit. This is a reasonable perception to have, because the player doesn't know what is intentional, what is random, or whatever. The player has expectations of your game that you may not understand. And the player generally assumes whatever their experience is, it's the normal experience, it's the average experience, it's the intended experience. They're not thinking about edge cases. They're not thinking about having done something terrible to their graphics drivers. They're not thinking about, whatever it is. So their conclusion is the tutorial is impossible to win because they tried it twice and they failed. This is not unreasonable. So already we've moved very far away from the underlying problem, which is that you're like, combat model works differently than you thought it did. And then the real problem comes in that the player is trying to do your job for you. They're trying to help. So, as you probably know, an actual bug report should look like this. Here is what I did. Here is what I expected to happen. Here is what actually happened. And you need all three. If you just say, here's what I did and what happened, I don't really, I get a lot of bug reports where people are like, I did this and then this happened. And I'm like, yes, correct. That is what's meant to happen. What did you expect to happen, So people don't even report their perception. Like a good bug report is here. At least they're reporting you their perceptions. But then, now people are trying to help. They're doing their own game design stuff. they have assumptions about it. They're trying to they think about your game, obviously, that's great. And so, yeah, they decide that because the tutorial is impossible to win because the balancing is bad and the rifles are too strong in the game. So that's not a problem. Well, you spend a lot of time on balancing, rifles are just fine, but that's what they came up with. And so we then get to what does the player actually write? What is the actual text of the message? So again, they assume that their experience is typical and intended. They do not describe their experience. They describe at best their perception of the experience and often their kind of conclusion from the experience. And so what they write is rifles are OP or OP. And so that's what you get. That's the message you're getting at the other end. And this is now like, no, they're not. You start arguing with the player about game balance. And the player's actually just upset because the tutorial's broken. So, and it's not quite the end of it because, yeah, the player writes something, but the player writes it within their own cultural context, within their own language and whatever. There's still a disconnect between what the player has actually said and what actually arrives in your brain. You just have different subcultures using different expressions. Again, you have different assumptions, you have different slang. Like I have some reviews of my games which are in Chinese, and it's really funny when you try to put them through machine translation because it's poetic gibberish. And I checked and it's gamer slang. It like, you know, it doesn't make any sense because it's slang terms in Chinese that don't translate. And there's just cultural differences as well. If you've, my games have quite a large Russian community, and this is really great, but Russians are very direct people. If something is bad, they will tell you, this is bad, or usually they use worse words. And they really don't mean it in a mean way. They are just communicating to you directly. And if you're used to like English-speaking countries, or like especially like British English, where everyone's like, well, I do think it could be improved slightly, which means this is garbage, they will just say, this is garbage. So you have to be aware of that. And the reverse as well, of course. If a British person says, well, I think it still needs some work, that means, oh God, just throw it away. So yeah. And yeah, also just this like jargon that shifts over time, like was imprecise, like, you know, this is a hill I've stopped trying to die on, but lag means delay. Like if you have something that has a lag, you do a thing and then it takes a moment for it to happen. It's a network delay or it's a processing delay or whatever. When people now say a game is laggy, they mean it's slow. Which, yeah, there's a very related concept, but they're not the same concept. And again, you can spend a lot of time trying to track down network lag when you should be fixing your game performance. Or, you know, the game crashes. Well, is it freezing or is it crashing to desktop? Because this can have very different causes. So you have to be pretty precise. And yeah, these people aren't professional testers. They're not going to be precise in their jargon. So what do you do? Sorry, I didn't move that, but well, I told you what was on the slide. So what do you do? Well, yeah, you try to kind of look at each of these points and you try to think, well, you know, what was the player thinking? Where is the player from? Am I even interpreting these words correctly? Then what is the player thinking? What do you think the player's experience was? And in the places where you think there's a disconnect, you can then ask follow-up questions. So instead of arguing with the player because the player says things that you think are wrong, you kind of go step by step to what hopefully is at least their perception so you can figure out what the underlying bug is. And yeah, there are some hopeless cases. Some people will just not reply to follow-up questions. Some people have a very strange view on your game and you cannot communicate with them. Some people just have computers that have been cursed by a witch and that's why the game doesn't work on their computer. And there's the occasional troll, but those are rare. And the other thing is that if you have really big fans who are really into your game and have been with your game for a long time, you can also actually teach them how to report bugs in more or less the right format. And they're very happy because they want to help. So, you know, And that's the thing, right? People send you feedback because they want to help. It can be super painful and confusing, but it's actually a gift. Maybe a bit of a weirdly wrapped one. So yeah, in practice, other super duper duper important thing, players, when they tell you about a problem, what they most want is acknowledgement. It is actually less important to fix the problem than to tell them, I see that you have a problem and it is real. That's what they want to hear. They understand the computers are weird and cursed and not everything can be fixed, you know. But they are used to screaming against this blank wall of these huge game corporations who do not give a rat's ass about them. And that's also often why they are come across very strong, they come across very angry because they're already very angry at some other gaming company or at some other thing where they did have a genuinely bad experience. And now the assumption is, well, you know, developers are lazy, they just want your money, they don't care about the bugs or whatever, and it's not true for you. It's probably not even true for the actual developers in these companies, but they're not reaching the developers right. So yeah, they want to be acknowledged. I really had people saying horrible, horrible things about how this is the worst game ever and it's so bad. And I just told them, yeah, I can see how that's a problem. I'm sorry. And then they're super happy. And in fact, the thing is, if they have such strong emotions about your game, they have strong emotions about your game. It's actually not too uncommon for people who really hate your game because it doesn't work for them to hate it because they want to love it. So if you can give them a reason to love the game instead, you can really flip them. People who are indifferent are going to stay indifferent. Of course, the flip side is also true. You can also really, really piss off people, but this is not about community management. This is about bug reports. And yeah, you have limited reserves of kindness and patience, of course, but they do pay off. As I said, people are trying to communicate and they want to be acknowledged. And most people like follow-up questions. Not everyone, but 3/4 of people. If you actually read what they said and you ask them a sensible follow-up question, they tend to be helpful. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, finally, key points. It's all from a real pain point. Players kind of expect to be disappointed by game companies. You can convert them into fans by caring. And they do really assume that whatever they just experienced is a normal and intended experience, even if it was actually weird. Okay, that's it. So that's the end of the talk. If you have questions or anecdotes to share, we do in fact even have a microphone, supposedly, somewhere. Yes. If someone has, otherwise we will just end the talk. Anecdotes are great.
When I make like games, I usually like imagine how the first screen or like the beginning is like a person that you never really met and you already assume a lot because of how they look. And that's the way I see games. I think you can, from the style alone, already kind of hint to what it will be. And sometimes when a person comes late, for example, the first time you meet them, then you already assume that they're like always going to be late. So I just always feel like, oh, what's like the first impression that this game is going to have on a person? Like a person. Like this game is actually a person, and how is it towards another person? Yeah, kind of like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, games are about emotions. Obviously, people are going to have emotional relationships with the games.
And assumptions as well.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's also important to, also in your marketing materials, make sure that, yeah, you create the right assumptions for your games. I think part of why my first game, Airships, is so successful is that it's unapologetically a game for it's unapologetically complicated games with a lot of buttons, and so people who don't like games with lots of buttons aren't even going to try playing it, which is great.
That's great.
One thing that you can do to like better gauge the difference between how you know the game works and what the player might be expecting is to do like analytics or a survey or something at the end. But even then, you have to be very careful about how you process also the survey data, because if you, or this analytics data, because if you track how many people have completed the quest, and you see this quest hasn't been completed by anyone, it might not be because this quest is too hard, but because no one has even found it in the first place. Then you start tracking how many people have started it, and then maybe it wasn't actually too hard to find. You've just made the quest giver too much of an asshole for people to care. So yeah, you just gotta be very mindful even when processing your own data, not just external player feedback.
Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing. That's all for the official part. So feel free to stick around, have some drinks, and yeah. And as I said, next time we're going to talk about accessibility.